And now Magnus g5 and then h5. He is going for the attack. In this video, Magnus Carlsen destroys Fabiano Caruana and his English opening in a brutal chess.com blitz game taken from September 2024. Now in the game, Fabiano Caruana is playing as white. He opens 1c4, the English opening. Magnus goes e5, the king's English. And now Fabiano Caruana throws a curveball. He goes d3. What is the idea behind this move? Well, it's very simple. Fabiano wants to go for a reversed Najdorf Sicilian with the moves knight f6 and then a3. And if black ever goes d5, he's going to have literally a Najdorf Sicilian with the white pieces and an extra tempo. Let's see how it works out. Here, Magnus knight to f6, knight f3 attacks the pawn on the e5 square, knight c6 defends the pawn, and then Fabiano Caruana, he goes a3. Again, heading for a reverse Najdorf, but will Magnus Carlsen allow it? It turns out he will. Here, Magnus breaks in the center with the move d5, and we have a reversed open Sicilian after c takes, knight takes, and now literally a reversed Najdorf Sicilian on the board. Only the main difference here, it's actually white to move instead of black normally. All right, here, Fabiano Caruana has a variety of ideas in the game. Instead of going for the Najdorf move e5, he actually goes e3, heading for a Scheveningen-style pawn structure with those pawns on d3 and e3. So how is Magnus going to respond? He starts bishop d6, sort of a reversed 6 bishop d3 Najdorf on the board so far. Now bishop e2 for Fabiano, and then a5 for Magnus Carlsen, expanding on the queen side in this crazy English opening. Now from here, Fabiano Caruana goes b3. The idea is he wants to go bishop b2, putting that bishop on the long diagonal and exerting a lot of pressure here. But Magnus Carlsen, he came prepared. And in this position, he busts out an absolutely ludicrous idea. g5, expanding on the king side. He's playing some sort of weird reversed Kerez attack against the Scheveningen. His main idea is to go g4 and then knock off the knight, then h5, h4, and then maybe even g3 in the future, launching an attack. All right, let's see how Fabiano Caruana responds. In the game, he goes h3, trying to stop the g4 advance. However, this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead, he should have just continued with ideas like bishop b2, getting on with his development. But instead, h3 on the board, and now Magnus, he is not slowing down one bit. He goes h5, setting up the g4 idea. Of course, first Magnus is going to have to go, say, rook g8 or something similar. Otherwise, if you go g4 right away, then h takes, and then rook takes h8 wins the rook. But again, this is all part of Magnus Carlsen's plan here. All right, Fabiano, bishop b2, a good idea, but then Magnus, rook g8, the last preparatory move, and now he is ready for that g4 break, busting open the king side. Now Fabiano, he's no dummy. He spots the threat, and instead of going, say, knight d2, continuing development, he actually goes knight f d2, getting the knight out of the way of the attack of the g-pawn preemptively. So, very good idea. But now Magnus, he's not slowing down. He busts through with the move g4, gaining more and more space. Now, believe it or not, there is a threat of simply going g3 in this position. If Magnus gets that off, he's either A, going to destroy white's pawn structure, or if white, say, goes f3 or takes, then bada boom, knight takes e3, wins the undefended pawn on e3, as that pawn is no longer on f2 defending. So, Fabiano Caruana has to defend against this threat right now. Let's see what he does. He starts by taking on g4, h takes. Not a bad idea at all. Now, he does have this open h-file for the rook, and that's a very interesting development. But again, g3 is still a threat here, and in this position, he stops the threat with the move g3. So, great idea by Fabiano Caruana. Again, if you don't do that, let's say you go queen c2 or any other developing move, then g3 would be the move for Magnus Carlsen. And again, one way or another, that pawn on f2 is going to get obliterated, and that pawn on e4 is going to be super, super vulnerable. So, g3, not a bad idea at all by Fabiano Caruana. Of course, the one problem or the one drawback with this move is it does weaken the light squares on the king side, especially that f3 square. And Magnus Carlsen may be able to take advantage of that in this weird English opening scenario. All right, now from here, Magnus, bishop e6. He continues development. Very good idea. And now knight c4 for Fabiano Caruana, putting pressure on that bishop on d6 and setting up knight b d2 ideas in the future. Now Magnus is having none of this. He very quickly expands on the queen side with the move b5. This is a crazy move because now the queen side is weakened, and Magnus is not going to be able to castle on the queen side, or if he does, his king is going to be incredibly vulnerable if he does that. Now here, Fabiano, he takes the bishop with tempo. Knight takes d6, c takes d6, and then he breaks in the center with the move d4. This is an extremely strong move in this position, and it's a multi-purpose move. First of all, he's responding to a flank attack, that being g5 to g4, with an attack in the center. That is almost always a good idea. Beyond that, he's also setting up threats of d takes e5 and bishop takes b5. Of course, with that pawn no longer being on the d3 square right here, this diagonal for the bishop does open up when you play that move d4. So, very good multi-purpose move by Fabiano Caruana. Now, Magnus, what should he be doing in this position? Well, technically the best move is you take on d4, and then you have a bunch of liquidations with bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, and overall Magnus is doing okay, but that would kill a lot of his momentum in the game. So instead of that, he actually goes for the slightly weaker move, e4, trying to keep the center closed. Now, the problem with this move is you basically lose the pawn on the b5 square for very little compensation. However, Magnus does maintain his attack, and he wants to attack at all costs in this game against Fabiano Caruana. Now here, instead of the immediate bishop takes b5, Fabiano Caruana plays an intermediate move, knight d2. The idea behind this move is you're maintaining the attack on the pawn on b5, but you're also attacking e4 while developing the knight with tempo. Now, Magnus Carlsen, rook b8, defends the pawn on the b5 square. Good move, but the problem with this move is it leaves the pawn on e4 undefended, and of course, Fabiano Caruana jumps in and takes the pawn immediately with the move knight takes e4. Now, you may be wondering, why did Magnus defend the pawn on b5 with the rook instead of defending the pawn on e4? Aren't central pawns worth more than the flank pawns? Well, that is correct, but here Magnus has a very specific idea in mind. Here he goes f5, advancing on the king side with the gain of tempo on the knight on e4, and he may even be threatening f4 in certain lines. So that is Magnus Carlsen's idea. Now here in this position, instead of immediately defending the knight on e4, Fabiano Caruana finds a better idea. He goes rook c1, targeting the knight on c6 with the gain of tempo, developing the rook before defending the knight on e4. Now Magnus, how does he defend the knight on c6, or does he just take the knight on e4 right away? Well, in the game, he plays a crazy-looking move, king to d7. He defends the knight on c6 with the king instead of the queen. Of course, queen d7 would have been the stronger and simpler move, but Magnus going king d7, and he has a very specific idea in mind with this move. Here, Magnus, he actually wants to go rook to h8 right away, challenging the rook on h1 and trying to gain control of the h-file. And by going king d7 instead of queen d7, here Magnus has the h8 square indirectly defended by the queen. That way he can go rook to h8 right away, then recapture with the queen. So Magnus having a very specific idea in mind with this king move. Now Fabiano Caruana, knight to c3, getting the knight out of the way of the attack, but Magnus is not done. He goes rook to h8, challenging the rook on h1. Of course, that rook on h1 is hanging. Fabiano Caruana has to do something about it, and in the game, he just takes on the h8 square. Rook takes, queen takes on the board, and now Fabiano, he finally wins that pawn on the b5 square, and he wins it with the knight. Knight takes b5. Now Magnus Carlsen, knight c to e7. The idea being he wants to reroute the knight over to the king side and get it out of the way of the attack of the rook on the c1 square. Now Fabiano, a4, expanding on the queen side, defending the knight on b5, and beyond that, there's another additional idea here. He actually wants to go bishop to a3, piling up pressure on that pawn on the d6 square. Fabiano Caruana trying to find some sort of counterplay, as if he just waits around and finds out Magnus is going to go queen to h2 or queen to h1 and get his attack going on the king side. Now here Magnus, he has a big decision. Do you bring the queen to the h2 or the h1 square? In the game, he actually goes queen to h2. Now, real fast, why did he do this instead of going queen to h1 in this position? Well, there's a very specific reason why. With queen to h2, his idea is to go queen g1 check next instead of checking immediately. Then, if the king goes to the d2 square with the queen on g1, he can immediately win that pawn on the f2 square, whereas that would not be possible if he went queen to h1 first. So that is the idea. Now Fabiano, bishop to a3, targeting the pawn on d6 with both the bishop and the knight, is going to have a big decision. Which piece do you recapture with? Now Magnus, he shows his idea, queen to g1 check, hitting the king, and of course, if king d2, then queen takes f2, wins the undefended pawn, and then after that, these pawns on the e3 and the g3 squares are going to be incredibly vulnerable with no pawn defending them. So with that in mind, you cannot go king d2. Instead, Fabiano finds the better idea, bishop to f1, blocking the check with the bishop. Now, Magnus here in this position, he has to find a way to continue the attack right now. And what's it going to be? Well, this is a great time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus Carlsen in this position. All right, I hope you found it. The key idea for Magnus here, of course, is going to be the breakthrough on the king side with the move f4. Brilliant move. The idea being you're trying to blow open the king side, and no matter how white recaptures either g takes or e takes, it's going to create weaknesses in his camp. For example, the move g takes f4, believe it or not, is actually a huge blunder. Here, Magnus has the incredible move g3, trying to blow open the king side. And now if you don't take the pawn, then queen takes f2 is checkmate on the spot. The audacity of Magnus threatening checkmate in one move in this variation. And if you do take the pawn, then the pawns on g3 and e3 are going to be hanging to the queen. So that would be an absolute disaster. So instead, here in this position, after f4 by Magnus Carlsen, Fabiano takes with the e pawn. That is the better move. But the disadvantage of this is it does open up the e file for the rook. So rook to e8 may be a move in the future for Magnus Carlsen. And beyond that, we're seeing the second idea of f4 a move prior. Here, Magnus, he jumps in with the knight to the newly created f5 square. Of course, when f5 was being occupied by the pawn, that was not possible. But fast forward here to this position, now knight to f5 is a possibility, and Magnus jumps in with the knight. So Magnus giving up the pawn to open up the e file and give the knight the very strong square on f5. That is well worth a pawn, especially in an attacking blitz game. Now here, Fabiano Caruana, what should he be doing? Well, the computer likes the idea of queen takes g4, winning the extra pawn. But then if Magnus just goes rook to h8, he continues the attack all the same. Instead, here, Fabiano plays a much weaker idea, queen to e2, targeting the bishop on d6 or e6 in certain lines. However, the problem with this move is that it lines up the queen with the king on the e file, and Magnus immediately pounces on this fact with the very strong idea rook to e8, lining up the rook with the queen and the king. Now the threat is going to be bishop to f7, and if Magnus gets that off unchecked, then he's simply going to win the queen on e2, as there is no good way to block the e file for Fabiano Caruana. Now here in this position, what should Fabiano be doing? Well, in the game, he goes king d2, immediately getting his king off the open e file. However, there was a stronger idea in this position. Simply knight takes d6, winning the pawn on d6, and if black goes bishop f7, you can take the rook on the e8 square. Now that line is very, very complicated. Trust me when I say that. We're not going to cover it all in depth, but if you do like analyzing variations on your own, I definitely recommend checking out this move, knight d6 for Fabiano Caruana. Now instead, king d2 on the board for Fabiano, and now Magnus finds the most appropriate follow-up, bishop to f7, opening up the attack of the rook on the queen on the e2 square. Now Fabiano Caruana takes on g4, queen takes g4, and then Magnus jumps in with the queen, queen takes f2. Magnus is starting to get his attack going, and things have gone from very good for Fabiano to absolutely awful. Now here, bishop e2 blocks the check, but then queen to e3 continues the attack. Now king d1, the king is forced to go back, but then queen takes b3, wins a pawn with tempo. Now the king moves again, king to e1, but then queen takes g3, wins yet another pawn, and potentially forces the queens off the board. Now this is a very important detail. If Fabiano does nothing, this bishop on e2 is currently pinned by the rook, meaning queen takes g4 is a legitimate threat. However, if he takes the queen on g3, as Fabiano did in the game, queen takes g3 on the board, then knight takes g3, and suddenly this bishop on the e2 square is pinned by the rook on the e8 square, and it's very difficult to defend. Here, Fabiano Caruana just goes king to f2, but then after knight takes e2, Magnus Carlsen wins a piece. Now Magnus has the extra knight versus the extra pawn of Fabiano, and that may be enough to win the game here on the spot. All right, Fabiano, rook c2, targeting the knight, but then knight e takes f4, wins back the pawn. Now Magnus is just up a clean piece. Now Fabiano, knight takes d6, trying to win that pawn, but then bishop g6, getting out of the attack of the knight and targeting the rook on the c2 square. All right, rook b2. This is the last fatal mistake for Fabiano Caruana. Here, Magnus, you don't have to be a very stable genius like Hans Niemann to find this move. Knight to d3 targets the rook on b2 and the king on f2. The knight forking the two pieces, the king moves, and now instead of taking on b2 immediately, Magnus Carlsen adds the disrespect with the move rook to e3 check, And in this position, Fabiano Caruana resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video, smash that like button. Seriously, smash it right now. It's the #1 thing you can do to help me out. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist and let me know in the comment section below what you thought of this video. And I'll see you in the next video.